I was really happy to be invited to be a part of this collective care series. Collective care, why do we need it? What is it? What can it look like? And the people speaking in the series will all look at this from different angles. I look at collective care from an angle of emotions, specifically political emotions. I am not a psychologist. I did not study philosophy. I did, in fact, study political science, but as you may not, it may not surprise you that the topic of emotions did actually not really factor very much in my classes or at all. There is in academia a very intense discussion about the topic of political emotions. And if you have the time and the mind space to dive into that, then I would direct you towards the writings of Martha Nussbaum and Sarah Ahmed, for example. My own approach to political emotions is very much informed by my work with activists and with groups and teams, people who are involved in shaping democracy, thinking about democracy, or just dealing with a very complex world and trying to work with very diverse teams. So this is very much more kind of from a practical working context. And also as a coach for the public narrative method, which is basically a political storytelling method that utilizes emotions and personal experiences. That is also a perspective that I bring to this topic. That being said, obviously, I also come to this topic with my very personal positionality, which is as a cis heterosexual woman of color, who has grown up and been shaped by a predominantly white and Western culture, and also the educational system that comes with it. So obviously my perception is limited and my views are very subjective. And so I'm like all of us trying to dig myself out of that and broaden my horizon. But I would really like to invite you to cross-check what you hear from me, compare with what your perception and your experience is. And please do share that with us in the Q&A, because as always, we're also here to learn and learn together. So let's dive in. My interest in politics, the future, what the future might look like, and diversity actually started in outer space. Here, in Star Trek, The Next Generation. So my happy place as I was growing up was Starship Enterprise, and I would spend my afternoons curled up on the sofa and have my big blue hoodie pulled over my knees and immersing myself in that universe of Star Trek. And I've told a story before saying that I always dreamed of being part of this crew and living in this place that is full of the creatures of all shapes and sizes from all kinds of backgrounds all over the universe. And everybody there was so different, but they had a place on this ship in the crew. So they belonged and they explored space together and encountered other civilizations. And I think I probably longed for a place like that because in the real world, I very much felt like an alien with no ship or crew. Growing up in a very rural, white Catholic environment as the only mixed family, and feeling like I was, in fact, an alien in that environment. So, but then again, looking at my obsession with Star Trek through the lens of emotions, I would say that I actually lived partly with part of that crew at home. Because looking at it through the lens of emotions, I would say that one of the things that I had in my family was my father, who reminds me more of a Vulcan, who has emotions, very strong emotions, doesn't show them. My mother, who was more like the fierce fighter Klingon, who used to display her emotions very fiercely. And that led to me channeling my inner Consular Diana Troy, who then had to learn to read and understand and mitigate and facilitate everybody's emotions. My favorite character on the show was Data, the android. who in fact has no emotions. And I had a huge crush on Data. And I have a suspicion that that was because I reckoned if he has no emotions, then he's also no trouble. And emotions certainly did seem to always mean trouble. Mainly because of the situation I was describing as the family with our mixed background in this environment. And so my mother was a migrant healthcare worker, and she basically had all the troubles and the difficulties that one might face in an environment like that. As a woman of color in a white Catholic environment, as a very strong-willed woman in a patriarchal marriage. And my mom's advice to me always was to never stay quiet when I felt that something was wrong or if somebody was treating me disrespectfully. And I witnessed her time and again as a child standing up against racism, against stereotyping, sexism, catcalling. And I saw her in return being ignored, belittled, and talked down to for doing so. So you might think that the conclusion of the story is that that made me a very strong-willed little girl who owned her emotions and confidently acted upon them, but it's actually not true. But what I did learn was to also ignore, belittle, and talk down to people who openly displayed their emotions. So I adopted that stance that appearing stoic and unmoved, rational, was superior to acting emotionally. And I started to seek the approval of people who functioned the same way. So the question is, what's political about that? It's a very particular experience of a specific family. And what does it have to do with the topic of political emotions and the potential of political emotions to actually transform the status quo? Well, when we see it in the context of activism, where I then years later ended up, is what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to make change, which means that we try to move the status quo. And what does it actually need to make change? Obviously, we need to know what we want. We need to know why we want it. They call it purpose. We can set ourselves goals. We can draw up a strategy. We can acquire the knowledge that we need about the situation, about the issues that we're facing, the cause that we're working for. We can acquire the skills we need to follow through with our strategy and to reach our goals. And quite often, even though we cognitively know what we want and we know what would be the right thing to do to achieve what we want, it doesn't necessarily always work out that way. I think everybody knows these examples of, have you ever set yourself a goal as in, I want to get into shape, like in 3 months, I want to be in shape, or I really want to go to bed earlier so that I can be awake and refreshed in the morning, or next time I'm going to start work on my project sooner so that I can actually finish it before the deadline. And we all know exactly what we would have to do that. And yet, quite often, it doesn't happen. So humans pride themselves for being rational, and logical thinking and intelligence are commonly viewed as separate from, and especially superior to, emotionality. And especially in the Western, very individualistic, capitalist culture. But in reality, humans are social beings and emotional beings foremost. So this whole talk about the rational human is actually, I don't know who came up with that, but they probably haven't really met a lot of humans before. And there's a ton of research on that that very clearly shows over and over again that our emotional state actually determines so much of our everyday life. There are experiments that showed that depending on your emotional status, how you judge your situation, how you make decisions, how you communicate with others, how you interpret other people's communication or action and your behavior. In the end, it determines all of this without us actually noticing it. It even like emotions even determine our health, our ability to learn, and obviously our social relations. So it's basically how we work and function through our nervous system. And I talked to a philosopher from Nigeria about this. He's called Akanimo Akpan, and he kind of put it into a sentence that I found very clear. But he said, "We're not rational. We're just very good at rationalizing our behavior," and that's probably what it comes down to. So I always like to show this very, very old picture that I came across, I think, when I was 12, which just kind of illustrates how we can know all the facts, we can know the statistics, we can know what the right thing to do is, but still somehow we can't get moving. So the question is, what actually does it take to get us into action? And if we are concerned with political activism and want to make changes, then the moving, the action is actually what we need. And some of those factors are, we need to actually believe that we can make a difference, that there's hope, and we need the moral resources to act, which means we need courage. And where do we find courage? Courage is based on our values, and our values are usually already shaped very early in life through experiences, through relationships that we had with people, behavior that we observed, things that actually happened to us. And they shape what is important to us and what the things are that we just really cannot let go of, that we need to be involved with, and because they're so important to us. And when we think about the moments where these values were shaped, they are emotional moments. So this is really where our capacity, our moral capacity, and our courage is based. And without emotions, that will not be possible. So no emotions, no values, no need to act. It's actually really one of the basic things that we need to be aware of in our activism, is why are the things that are important to us? Why are they important? What has shaped us and our perception? And how can we actually make use of that and make a change in the cause that we're engaged in? So when we look at the word emotion from like the root of it in the Latin root, there was always the aspect of motion in there. And it's actually, in the original meaning, it actually means that it's a social moving, that is a stirring and agitation. And only the meaning of strong feeling came to the word much later. Which means that emotion, and motion as part of this word, it really means movement. And it is what we do in activism, is that we want to actually move things forward, want to move the status quo. And in scientific terms, of course, emotions are framed as our body's natural, immediate physiological response to situations or things that happen around us. And they are very primal and immediate. So it's nothing that we can control. They have a purpose because our nervous system is built to keep us alive and thriving. And so the purpose of emotions is to navigate through life by guiding our decisions and actions based on what feels good or bad for us personally. And they're also there to aid us in connecting with others by allowing communication through nonverbal cues, and obviously also through verbal communication. But then if you look at this in activism, this is exactly what we need. Our emotions point us towards the topics, towards the things that we want to be engaged in, and they show us what the change is that we want to make. And connecting with others is what we need, because making that change is only possible together. First of all, big change, systemic change can only be achieved in large numbers. And also, we need to sustain each other through that struggle. We need to be together in order to nourish and nurture our moral resources that will help us make, hopefully, make change possible. But it is definitely the case that strong emotions are usually resisted because they are uncomfortable. And that already starts early in life, when we tell children off for throwing anger tantrums, when we criticize adults for displaying anger. And quite often, actually, it's the case that when we see this kind of behavior in other people, that we penalize it by withdrawing our love and affection. And anger is a really special case in those emotions, because it's a very strong emotion, and it usually signals that there's something wrong, that a boundary has been crossed. It's also a very stigmatized emotion because it's labeled as destructive, as threatening. And if you think about who is allowed to feel and display anger, or even act on it, then you can imagine that if a person who is perceived as masculine displays anger, people will usually look this way and say, that person is angry, there must be something wrong. Whereas if you have a person who's perceived to be feminine and that person displays anger, then people will probably look at her and say, she's being so loud, what is wrong with her? So it's very different how feelings are perceived in different people. And then if you think about the positionality of people, as in women of color, Black women, where there's a special stigma in being labeled as irrational or hysteric or not feminine. And we know this as people. And that's the political thing about what I was telling you earlier, my experience in my family, is that you learn to adjust because you know what the societal expectations are. You know what's expected of you that will make you feel welcome, that will make you feel like you're loved and you belong. So it's definitely a very, it's a process of infiltrating people's emotional lives and how they perceive their emotions, how they are in touch with them, how they learn to act on them or not act on them. And you see this especially in children that are perceived as girls, that they are more likely to be told to suppress their anger, and it is not okay to feel angry. I mean, it's definitely also the case for boys that it is not a behavior that is welcomed, but it is perceived as more normal. So children that are perceived as masculine will be allowed to display their anger and to act on it, whereas girls learn very early on that this is something that will lead to them being isolated, or to affection being withdrawn from them. What they do learn, though, is that instead it's okay to be sad. So there, you may know this, or you may know people for whom this is true, that there's this phenomenon where when women get angry, they cry. And this is actually not necessarily the regular living out of anger, but it can be a learned behavior because you have learned that it's okay to cry and it's okay to be sad and then people will support you and they will give you affection. Whereas if you went in full on rage and you yelled at people, or maybe you would throw something, then this is definitely a behavior that would be punished. And it would be punished by isolation. It would be punished by people saying, I'm not going to talk to you if you talk to me in this tone of voice. And that is actually one of the core emotions that people fear, is shame and isolation, because being shamed means basically that you're not worthy of love and belonging. And it would mean that you are being pushed out of the tribe. And if you're pushed out of the tribe, then basically your life is in danger and your health is in danger. So it's something that is very, very deeply ingrained in us, wanting to appear lovable, wanting to be accepted in order to be part of the group and in order to feel this belonging. So there's a lot of unconscious adjusting that goes on, depending on where you've grown up and depending on what people have modeled to you. But as you see in the case of my childhood, it's not necessarily because somebody models a very, like a lot of agency and self-worth, and knowing, you know, their emotions and not holding back. Doesn't mean that you are actually going to copy that as a child. But if you see how other people react to that, then you might very well learn to also navigate the world in a different way, and then take on the societal expectations and the societal pressures that are around. So in the end, anger is, of course, neither good nor bad. It's just a sign that obviously something is wrong, that probably a boundary has been crossed. And that means that this is actually a wake-up moment. There's something that you need to pay attention to. There's something that's important to you. And that is actually a moment where action can happen, and it can be an accelerator for movement and for change. So what happens when people are trained by society to not be angry and to not show anger? For one thing, we can end up feeling apathy, which means this forward driving force is missing. We don't really know how to move forward, get into action, make a change. On the other hand, also unexpressed anger can turn inwards, towards ourselves, and it might consume us from the inside, or it will just find other ways out of our system, and it might make us lash out at innocent people who were not part of the situation. And we may start to offload our frustrations at the people around us, rather than being focused on the thing that actually does need changing, because there's a righteous anger about it. So when we look at this at a societal level, very similarly, it may keep us stuck in situations that are unhealthy for us, and we might not defend our boundaries. We might not try to improve the conditions that we are in. And then quite often in peaceful democracies, we don't really learn what the channels are to express outrage or to make change in a meaningful and an impactful way. So just thinking, for example, of demonstrations in Germany, and that we've talked with people who are here about this, that even demonstrations in Germany are often very quiet events. So there is this stance of taking a certain pride in being sensible and civilized. And for one thing, you don't really know, you don't get the sense that there's an actual will for change behind that. But also what it does is that there's a lot of tone policing around people who are actually maybe more desperately need of change, and who express this in an emotional way. And this goes as far as this is not only about expressing emotions, but also through the lens of diversity. It's quite often the case that the democratic scene is a very academic scene. And then if people come in who don't speak the language perfectly, who are not up to date to the latest politically correct vocabulary, and who come from different backgrounds and just have a different way of communicating, that is absolutely penalized and pushed out and is perceived as not the proper way to do politics and to do things. So the same way of kind of cutting people off, showing people that they don't belong, and pushing people out is something that happens in this political sphere as well when it comes to emotions. And it would, in fact, be very important. This is a picture from our Radical Daughter Collective, displaying how important it is to show your anger. So probably everybody who has been active in politics or is active as an actor in an initiative trying to make change has felt these emotions at some point. So there's inertia and apathy, fear, there might be isolation, and also doubting that you don't even know whether you could make a difference. Especially these days, I hear that from a lot of people, and frankly, I feel like that I feel the same a lot of times, that there's just so many things going wrong. You don't even know where to start. It feels like it's impossible to make any difference, considering how many things would have to change and how many things would have to change on a grand scale. So this is what in community organizing we call action inhibitors. And so these slides are courtesy of the Deepen Chain Network. And these are emotions that we talk about when we talk about public narrative, which is the method with which we find out where our values were shaped and why, for us, each person individually, it is so important to work on a specific topic. And it's not so much the case that we kind of dig for trauma or we dig for hurtful experiences and say, see, this happened to me and this is why I have to change the world. But it's more the way that we want to find out what are the underlying values, how did we learn them? What are the specific moments where either something happened to us or we saw somebody act in a certain way. And the question always is, what did we learn from that? Like, what made it possible for us to turn a moment around, for example, to act when we saw something that was unjust? Or if we weren't able to act, how do we look at it now today? What do we know now that we don't know then that enables us to go into action now? So it's very much about knowing yourself and finding the resources to be active and to make a change today based on what we've learned in the past. So each of these action inhibitors, or so-called inhibitors, has also an action motivator. And so against inertia, so this feeling of just not being able to move, not seeing, like not having anything that pulls you forward or pushes you out of the status quo, is a sense of urgency. If we know either we have to act now, because if we don't act, then something terrible will happen, or maybe we have a very small window of opportunity now. And this is where we can have the chance to make a bigger change than if we do it 2 weeks later. This is something that can help. Apathy then is being countered by anger or outrage. Fear can be countered by hope, and isolation can be countered by solidarity. And the feeling of self-doubt can be countered by the feeling of self-worth. And the having had an experience of where you could actually make a difference. And that could even be something from very, very long ago. But you knew that there was a moment where what you did or what you said to somebody actually made a difference. And so it's these little moments that are really worth looking at. And usually, like, unless you actually have the chance to go to therapy, these are not questions that people ask you. And they're actually very valuable because they show you a lot of resources and a lot of strength that can help you actively in your activism today. So we've talked about anger and about how it's one of those very visceral emotions that also take a lot of energy. And this is important, of course, for the moment when you want to get into action and get into movement, and because it's like a fuel that will drive your actions. But you can't stay in anger the entire time, because first of all, it does take a lot of energy. For anybody who's ever been angry at someone or something, afterwards you're quite exhausted. And if you stay in this very urgent anger for a long time, then it will also take its toll on you from the inside. So what we want to do, we try to get to these feelings of hope and solidarity and self-worth, because those are the feelings, the action motivators that actually give us agency. And by agency, what we mean is, as we see up there on the slide sentence, the emotional capacity to make mindful choices, which means that what we're trying to achieve is that we're not constantly in reaction to the things that are happening around us or to things that are being done to us, but we try to be in a position where we can act in self-determination. And we actually know we are the people who have a plan, and we know what our resources are, and we act from that place. So rather than reacting, to be responding. And because this is from the political storytelling world, it also says that stories is actually what can help us overcome these action inhibitors, and they can help us dig up the action motivators by drawing on shared values and connecting with others and then moving into action together. So it's very much about understanding emotions as a resource and not just kind of like an internal weather that happens to us and that might actually be more of a disturbance, but to pay attention to where they come from, what they mean, and how we can use them in our activism. So in research, there's sometimes a distinction being made between emotions and feelings. Emotions being the kind of more immediate physiological reaction that happens in the body, and then feelings being the way that we interpret these emotions. And then that being the way that we were socialized, the way the experience that we've had as individuals, and then feelings being more of something that lingers after, so the emotion being something that comes up very quickly and goes away very quickly, and then the feeling being something like, what do we think about that emotion? How do we frame it? How do we interpret it? And do we hold on to it? And then what do we do with this? So as I said, I'm not a psychologist, so I haven't studied this phenomenon. It certainly is the case that we all experience emotions differently, but in my understanding, this approach more or less assumes that we all experience the same emotions in the same situations, and then we just attach different interpretations to them. I would argue, in the context of political emotions, that there's not only differences in how we interpret and frame our emotional reactions, but there's actually differences in which emotions are triggered in us, depending on our individual life experiences. So, for example, depending on what you've experienced in your life, your emotional reactions may deviate from the experience of others. For example, seeing a crowd of people, let's say a big crowd of men dressed uniformly and waving flags. Some individuals may experience excitement. Other individuals might experience fear. Being asked to show your personal identification in the street or on a train, or being asked to show the contents of your bag as you're leaving a shop. Some people may be surprised. Others may feel anger. Being asked about your family background may leave you feeling completely indifferent, or it may cause you to feel shame. Taking somebody to a train station or to a bus station and waving goodbye to them, for some people may be an exciting or cheerful experience. For others, it may cause profound sadness. So what actually makes an emotion political then? And I was wondering that because, so the last 2 days I was working in Austria with a group of activists who were who are hoping to make their city more sustainable and greener and safer for pedestrians. So for 2 days we were working on a project trying to achieve that, like having a traffic-free city. And at the same time, here in Berlin, a friend of mine was lying in hospital in a coma after she had been hit by a truck as a pedestrian crossing the street. So I was thinking of that, obviously, as we were working on this project. And then on the train back to Berlin yesterday, I got the call that my friend passed away. So the question is my grief personal? Because I lost a dear friend, and she was a very open, very helpful person and loving mother? Or is my grief political? Because the cities we live in are designed for cars, they're not designed for humans. And the place where she crossed the street was, there was constructions going on and there was no safe way made available for pedestrians. In April 2019, a refugee from Kenya by the name of Rita was murdered outside her refugee housing in Brandenburg, in a very rural, very remote area. And when she was reported missing, the German police made no efforts to find her. The remains of her body were found months later, and actually not far from the refugee housing site. And until this day, this case has not been solved, and Rita's murder has not been brought to justice. So is the outrage about that because a young mother of two who was looking for a better life has lost that chance and has experienced this terrible death? Or is the outrage about how the political systems that are in place actually do not give the same value to the lives of people of different color and different background? So is it private? Is it political? This week in Latina near Rome, Italy, the young farm worker Satnam Singh died while he was working in the farms near Rome, and he had no legal contract. He had exploitative working conditions without safety provisions, and he was denied medical aid after he was seriously injured while he was working. He was 31, and so is the death of this, again, young man who's leaving behind a family, who came and worked so hard to make a better future for himself and his family. Is it just sad and tragic because we can all relate? We all know people in this age who are trying to shape their lives? Or is it actually political because we know that this didn't have to happen, and that we know that there's actual laws in place that are supposed to keep people safe? We know, and actually I know from my experience, because my mother was a migrant worker, that it is possible to recruit people to work in other countries and to make this a safe experience and to have a legal framework around it. So again, is it private or is it political? And so I talked to different participants in different workshops recently about this topic of political emotion. And I asked people, like, could you actually name a political emotion? What's an emotion that's political to you? And then obviously in different contexts, different things were named. But things that came up again and again were empathy, compassion. And there was also disappointment and helplessness. And as we were talking about this, it came apparent again and again that there was actually not really a difference between the private and the political. Because as we were talking, for example, about disappointment or feeling not seen, there was this example of gaslighting in a relationship where people said, it's this horrible feeling where you try to explain to somebody something that is wrong and that is bothering you and that you want to change. And the person says, you're just imagining things. Which is actually exactly the same situation as in a political context to try to raise awareness about discrimination or racism or sexism or whatever the issue is, and then being told by the people in power or by the general public that you're overreacting, that is actually not that bad, that that was just like a one-off case, that is just something that you shouldn't be so sensitive. And also what we think about when we kind of try to describe what a good situation is to, for example, raise children, or how we relate to one another on a private level. And there's a saying of raising children means that you try to make them feel safe, seen, and supported. And in the end, it's not so different in the society we live in or in a political system that we're in, is that we want to be able to feel safe. There are people in positions of power and who have the responsibility, who in a democracy were given the responsibility to make sure that people are safe and that they can stay healthy and they can live life to their best possibilities. And also wanting to feel seen. So wanting to be taken seriously in our concerns and the way that we see the world, and the things that we feel we want to see in a different way. And then we want to be supported in that. And that's, I think, a huge point when we talk about, especially the situation in Europe now, where we see kind of gaps closing and spaces vanishing, where people can feel safe and where people can participate fully. And there's border controls again, that we think about how is it actually possible for people to make a change, which is something like that should not be limited to people with a certain passport or people who have lived in a place for generations, but how is it actually possible to get to power, and who has the chance to even get into a position of power. So this question of belonging and of power and of being able to be a full human being with all your emotions is something that is very, very political, I think. So with regards to time, what now? I think it's really important that we take our emotions seriously. For one thing, because basically, I mean, you could see it from a scientific sense and say emotions are data, and we need big data because it shows us what the status quo is, what's going on, what people want, and also, but on more embodied level, it's data for ourselves by our nervous system, which is built to help us survive and thrive, and to be a little bit more trusting towards, what the circumstances are doing with us and how our body is reacting to that and how we react to that emotionally. And to try to not ignore it. And this is something that I think is yet again another really important factor of who actually gets to have the time to interrogate themselves and their emotional world and the circumstances, because everybody has to struggle for their survival in this capitalist system, but also because, as we notice, especially with younger people, that they are so much in the grip of technology that is made especially to keep them hooked to their device, to keep them in these so-called short form formats of social media, where they're basically more or less trapped. And that's a very deliberate choice that people who program these apps made. So how do we navigate that, which is also a political topic, because there are ways to prevent these technologies from having this effect on people, but then who takes responsibility? And who actually has still kind of the freedom of mind and the time space to think about, why is the status quo the way it is? Who's in charge here? Who has responsibility? What can we change? And having the time, and that's something that we know very well in community organizing, that in the end, everything starts with a conversation. Who has the time to sit down with other people, and especially with strangers, which would be very important to do, and talk about how we feel and talk about what we're struggling with? Because if that communication is not happening, then change is never happening. So that's something, I think the topic of time and power of self-determination is something that is really important, that we need to keep in mind. And yeah, basically to be curious, to get to know ourselves, and be open and curious to get to know each other, because we need to be quite determined in building relationships and in building solidarity. And we need to be very determined to do that across difference, because it takes hard work. I don't know whether you have worked with people recently who are actually not completely like on your page regarding many things, but it's just so necessary that we don't let ourselves be divided. So yeah, that is for sure also something like a muscle that we all need to train. In regard to our challenges, we need to practice responding with agency so that we think about, why is this important? Why might I react the way that I am reacting? But now I can actually do it from a place of agency rather than lashing out. So understanding our emotions and actually harnessing them to build solidarity and to make a change together. And I don't know whether you've heard the term stretched collaboration before. I always like to actually see that in the context of yoga. I actually, whenever I work with people that I find very difficult to work with, I have my my yoga teacher's voice in the back of my head, where she says, just stretch as far as you can, hold it there, don't go too far. Every day is different, and it definitely is that, having this balance of knowing your boundaries and setting your boundaries and holding them and nurturing what you need to be nurtured, and then on the other side stretching as far as you can to reach the people who are further away from you, not overstretching, but trying again and again and expecting that it's not going to work every time, but having this balance and knowing yourself well enough of when to hold the boundary, when to open up, when to challenge yourself and grow. And then one of the things that my my teacher in Deep Democracy said recently was, if you know who actually said that, please let me know who to quote. But I think it was a South American shaman who said that when you are faced with an unsurmountable challenge, there are only two options. Either you crack a joke about it or it kills you. And I really like that, because in the end, it gives you a little bit of a choice and you don't want it to kill you. So you better start cracking jokes about everything that we do. And lastly, because before we finish off this part, when I was talking to people in my trainings about political emotion, the two that I found most powerful that came up were forgiveness and love. And it's so true because, we talk about things that we need in order to sustain ourselves through the struggle. And there are things like rest and joy, and rest is resistance and joy is resistance. But I think love is what we actually need to overcome. And maybe that's the most radical thing that we can do, is that we learn to love fiercely. And we just try again and again, and every day will be different. But we do it together. And we take collective care. So that's it from me.